All right, you should be
Okay.
up.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, Jim Dandridge has an inspiring background, which we have posted on the FSRA website. The hallmark of Jim's service is to pursue excellence in all endeavors with relentless determination. And there's no such thing as retirement as far as Jim is concerned. He's served with distinction in college, graduate school, the U.S. Army as a Green Beret, the Foreign Service, the Senior Foreign Service, and with DACOR upon leaving the State Department in 1997. So during the ensuing 24 years, Jim has undertaken leadership roles for a number of organizations. In 2008, Jim was awarded the Director General's Cup for Foreign Service, and he's received several other accolades since then. So Jim, welcome, and the floor is yours.
And thank you very much, Alan, for that very warm introduction. And also, I'd like to thank the Florida Foreign Service Retiree Association. You know, I would much rather be there with you in sunny Florida rather than here in the River City, as we affectionately call it. But that's a dream too far. As most of you know, and from Alan's introduction, I'm a triple former federal employee divided between the U.S. Army, the Foreign Service, and also a 20-year WAE assignment as Senior Inspector and Compliance Officer in the State Office of the Inspector General. Now, as though that wasn't enough, I'm in my third post-retirement incarnation in the foreign affairs community, having served in executive positions with ADST, with DCF, ADST, Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, the Diplomacy Center Foundation for the establishment of the National Museum of American Diplomacy, WIFA, the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs, and now DACOR. And in each, I promised my wife that, honey, this is the last one. Anyway, that's the story of my life. A life of making small contributions here and there. And let me share a little secret with you. All my federal incarnations have been personally and professionally rewarding, but DACOR is in line to probably be the apex of professional enjoyment. And I really mean that, because DACOR is an organization of true believers, and it embodies the ultimate spirit of volunteerism. And on top of it all, we like to think that that bridge is not too far in enhancing the combined foreign affairs community's support to the Foreign Service and to diplomacy. I don't have to tell you about the importance of the need for enhancing platforms of supporting communities nationwide to the Foreign Service, particularly now that, like it or not, global civilization is here today, not tomorrow. But before I continue talking about platforms, let me, I would normally ask how many of you have had the opportunity to visit the DACOR and Bacon House, and I would ask you to raise your hand. But since this is a webinar, why don't I just ask one of my development committee members and former co-chair of the DACOR committee, Ian Houston, to introduce you to the DACOR and Bacon House. Then I'll come and talk a bit about the historical grounding of DACOR before returning to our historical gym that will celebrate its bicentennial in 2025, right here in the President's neighborhood. So why don't we cue up Ian Houston.
Hello, my name is Ian Houston. I'm the development chair at the DACOR and Bacon House. This is an extraordinary property. 2 blocks from the White House, the house was completed by skilled but often unsung workers in 1825 for Tench Ringgold, with additions over time. We owe them our gratitude. It is an historic national treasure that serves as a living testament to America's political, cultural, and diplomatic heritage. 8 presidents have visited or stayed at the house, including James Monroe and Abraham Lincoln. 2 U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justices and an Associate Justice lived in the house: John Marshall, Melville Fuller, and Joseph Story. Key national, international, legal, cultural, musical figures have discussed key issues and performed uplifting music in the home. Sally and William Carroll, William, who was a clerk of the U.S. Supreme Court, owned the house from 1836 to 1895. They were close personal friends of President and Mrs. Lincoln and their children. When tragedy struck the Lincoln family and their son Willie died of typhoid at the age of 11 years old, the Carrolls grieved with the Lincolns. It is said that Lincoln came to the house to have some privacy and mourning for his beloved son. The friendship was so close with the Carrolls that the Carrolls touchingly offered their family vault at Oak Hill in Georgetown for Willie. Willie was interred there for 3 years, later being reinterred near his father at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, after President Lincoln's death. Virginia Murray Bacon was the last private owner of the house. She generously bequeathed it to the DACOR Bacon Foundation. She was a great supporter of the arts, and she wished for the house to be a meeting place to facilitate international peace and understanding by bringing together leaders in the fields of foreign policy and international relations and law for the purpose of defining and resolving international problems. This is precisely what DACOR is doing, and we are honoring the past with an eye to the future. Maintaining the property and keeping it modern is essential. Of course, doing so requires significant resources. Together we can be good stewards of this historic treasure of a house. We need your support and continued support, and we are and would be grateful for it. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Ian. That's our home base. 1801 F Street, Northwest, on the corner of 18th and F Streets, 2 blocks from the White House. Now I'm going to return to it, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about its illustrious history and the development of this young nation and home to DACOR. But first, let me tell you a little bit about DACOR. And it's soon to be 70th anniversary that we're going to be celebrating in 2022, next year. Now let's talk about how and why DACOR got started and its historical paths to where we are today. Then I will share with you how our home that you have just seen in the President's neighborhood puts us in the lead to reach out to communities across the country in support of foreign affairs. And finally, I'll talk about how we are integrating the DACOR 2022 70th anniversary and the DACOR Bacon House 2025 bicentennial into our efforts to be more relevant to our total membership and less insular in our thrust to expand our support base. Now, DACOR was incorporated 69 years ago in November of 1952, and some of its early accomplishments in the 50s and the 60s involved informal efforts to organize retired Foreign Service officers to improve retiree welfare, foster community, and to set up a service to assist Foreign Service parents with the education of their children in the U.S. Also, Foreign Service retiree welfare was a priority. Pension, health benefits were poor. Neither the department nor AFSA had made their improvement a priority. Now, you have to keep in mind that it was not until the 1970s that AFSA became the Foreign Service Union, although it predates DACOR from its earlier beginnings in 1922. DACOR's volunteerism strength started out in the 50s and continues through to today. And that's why you see a relatively small staff of 7 front office, plus the kitchen wait staff backed up with approximately 18 committees, equally carrying the load. Now, in the early days, DACOR's most active committees were legislative, placement, and welfare committees, which respectively worked to improve pensions and health benefits. They also helped to find retirees employment and aid to those that were in distress. It even established a group medical and hospitalization program for DACOR members in September of 1952. That was just before DACOR was incorporated. Now, frankly, DACOR was all things to all members in its very first days of incorporation. It lobbied Congress for better Foreign Service survivor annuities, which resulted in both 1958 and 1960 annuity increases of 10%. And in 1960, they were permanently tied to the cost of living indexes and began receiving the same treatment as civil service in 1970. Now, the DACOR and Bacon House, as it is now known, is a historic national treasure that serves as a living testament to America's political, cultural, and diplomatic heritage. It's located just 2 blocks from the White House, and it's one of the oldest residential buildings in Washington, D.C. In addition to serving as a center for civic-minded and foreign affairs professionals to gather and discuss the issues of the day, the house is also a museum that honors the nation's diplomatic history and shares art and artifacts and fascinating stories from around the world. The many strands that make up the story of the house and the stories of the people who lived and worked here really make for a fascinating story in political and social Washington from the very earliest years of our republic, and actually they deserve to be more widely told. Now, let's do some bullet checking here, following some of the key facts about the DACOR Bacon House. First, the iconic architecture of the house is uniquely American. It was built nearly 200 years ago, as I've already mentioned, in 1825 in the classic federal style at a time when the most powerful movers and shakers in the nation's history all wanted houses close to the president. It remains one of the oldest continuously occupied private residences in the area. Now, if you will take a look at the PowerPoint that is coming up, if you will run to PowerPoint 1, please, on the front of the house. If you look closely when the PowerPoint comes up, you'll be able to see a very faint trace. If you look at the right top window, just at the base, a very faint trace of the original roof line on the 4th floor side elevations. Now, this is evidence of a renovation that expanded the top floor in the mid-19th century. Now, on the next PowerPoint, over the years, the house and its adjacent garden and outbuildings have undergone significant renovations and expansions. Yet, it remains true to character. Another point about the house is that many of the workers who built the house were enslaved people. The DACOR Bacon House Foundation is undertaking an active research project to learn more about the identities of these workers. We actually have records of one woman enslaved by Tench Ringo. Tench Ringo was the first owner of the house, who sued for her freedom in 1837. And she was represented in her case by no less than Francis Scott Key. Now, the enslaved workers would have records. The enslaved would have done everything necessary to keep the house running, from stoking the fireplaces to maintaining the gardens to serving the family and their many guests. Now, over a dozen U.S. presidents are believed to have visited or stayed overnight in the house, including James Monroe, who was a close friend of Tench Ringo's, the Carrolls, who owned the house for nearly 60 years in the 19th century. The Carrolls, incidentally, were William Carroll was the clerk of the Supreme Court, and they owned the house for nearly 60 years in the 19th century. And as Eon mentioned during the video, they were very close to President Abraham Lincoln and First Lady Mary Todd. Now, and also, as you saw in the video, the Lincoln's son Willie died in 1862, and the Carrolls offered their own family tomb to house his mortal remains until they could be transferred to their permanent resting place in Springfield, Illinois. Now, during the tenure of Virginia Murray Bacon in the mid-20th century, the house hosted at least half a dozen presidents and presidents-to-be. And Mrs. Bacon herself was noted, well, she was actually a very close acquaintance of several of the former first ladies during the 20th century. Now, the plaques that are on the PowerPoint now show the story of the first 100 years, really, of the occupants of the house. Chief Justice Marshall, who served as Chief Justice longer than any tenured Chief Justice in the history of the Supreme Court, and also Chief Justice Fuller, who was the last Supreme Court justice to own the house. This plaque was placed on the house by the Columbia Historical Society and Bar Association of the District of Columbia. Actually, the house was the residence of at least 8 Supreme Court justices, including the 2 that I just mentioned, Chief Justice John Marshall and Chief Justice Melville Fuller, along with Justice Joseph Story. In the next PowerPoint, you will see depicted the South Room, as we affectionately call it. In Marshall's era, 5 of the justices boarded in the house together. They discussed the weather, they drank Madeira, they received visitors in chambers to discuss cases and petitions in the second floor drawing rooms of the house. Actually, as an aside, Chief Justice Marshall was a lover of Madeira. And he would send Chief Justice Story over to one of the 2 windows on the left side in the image on the screen now and ask him to give him a weather report. So it was either raining or the sun was shining. And Justice Story would return to Justice Marshall and give him the report. And Justice Marshall would reach over to his handy carafe of Madeira and fill the glasses of the cups of the associate justices and toast to their judicial responsibilities, and would go into chambers, a custom which exists to this day in the Supreme Court. Now, the story of the Madeira, whether they use that today or not, that's another story. But one of a famous trio of Native American tribal rights cases was decided during Chief Justice Marshall's tenure in the House in the early 19th century. Also, prominent and independent women owned the house. Well, let's put it this way. They were the de facto owners of the house in the throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. Chintz Ringo, who was the first owner of the house, he lost the house when he couldn't repay a mortgage note in favor of his daughter. For much of the 19th century, the house was effectively the property of Washington hostess Sally Carroll. And incidentally, going back to Chintz Ringo and his daughter, of course, the house reverted, since he borrowed the money from her, it reverted to her de facto ownership. The house was effectively the property of prominent Washington hostess Sally Carroll. From there, it went to Molly Fuller, who was the wife of Chief Justice Melville Fuller. And it was owned briefly by Gilded Age heiress Alice Copley Thaw, and then became the property of Virginia Murray Bacon, its last private owner and one of the most prominent grand dames of the mid-20th century Washington social scene. Now, the house was a critical element of the president's neighborhood, and it was a focal point of social, political Washington in the 19th and the 20th centuries. You could get 200 people or more gathered in the sheltered garden for an outdoor party. Virginia Baker's guest book contains the signatures of dozens of prominent representatives and senators, including several future presidents, business tycoons, and celebrities. In fact, when you visit the house, you'll notice that there's a Steinway grand piano in the house that was selected for Virginia Bacon by renowned musician Arthur Rubinstein, who was a frequent guest, along with conductor Eugene Armandie. This was not unusual in view of the fact that in those days, the National Symphony Orchestra performed in Constitution Hall, which was only about 2 blocks away, and Arthur Rubinstein would often, after his concerts at Constitution Hall, return to the house and have receptions with the hostess. And at a certain point, he suggested that, I think we need a better piano. Thus, when you visit us, you'll be able to see the piano that was selected and purchased by Arthur Rubinstein. Now, if that wasn't enough, the house was also once home to the Russian Imperial Legation. For a 3-year period, beginning in 1875, the house was leased to the Russian minister and his wife, who were fond of walking through the neighborhood when they weren't being driven in their carriage by servants with crimson livery. The house was the setting for many diplomatic parties during that time, including one given in honor of the visiting Grand Dukes Alexei and Constantine in 1877. And according to many accounts in the newspapers, a highlight of that evening was the unveiling of a piece of state-of-the-art technology, a sock darning machine. Now, as you see on this screen image, the house is registered in the National Registry of Historic Places, and it also operates as a museum, and it contains many historic pieces of art, furniture, and memorabilia celebrating the history of U.S. diplomacy and the Foreign Service. Now, the desk that you see here was owned by John Quincy Adams. It's one of the most prominent artifacts. This desk actually served more secretaries of state than any other piece of furniture for nearly 150 years. It's believed to have been used by John Quincy Adams to draft the Monroe Doctrine, and also by William Seward to sign the purchase agreement on Alaska. Also, The house is now the permanent home of the Tangiers, the U.S. legation in Tangiers, our very first legation. The doors of that legation are part of the museum. So as you can see, this house is a historical gem to which we are very proud to be the stewards of for the telling of the history of this young nation as it was developing. The house now serves as the home of DACOR, where we continue to tell those stories. DACOR, an organization of foreign affairs professionals, and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation, which owns and manages the house and operates the museum. Now, DACOR and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation sponsor many dinners, lectures, conferences, and other events, advancing their joint mission to fulfill Virginia Bacon's legacy and preserving the house as a venue for statesmanship, a permanent setting for foreign affairs and civic-minded professionals. The DACOR Bacon House is a touchstone linked to so many aspects of American history, that of Washington, D.C. itself, of the Supreme Court, of the distinctly American architecture, of social political Washington, of women's history, of enslaved workers' lives and history. And we at DACOR and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation are eager to work with those who share our passion for our nation's and our people's history, both locally and throughout the world. Now, DACOR today is a sort of a summary of the history of DACOR and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation. DACOR in the 1950s and 1960s was really a force for retiree welfare. It was incorporated in November of 1952 after 2 years of informal efforts to organize retired Foreign Service officers to improve retiree welfare, foster community, and set up a service to assist Foreign Service parents with the education of their children in the U.S. Foreign Service retiree welfare was the priority and continues to be an area in which we provide support to our sister organizations. Pension and health benefits were poor, and neither the department nor AFSA had made their improvement a priority at the time of DACOR's focus. The department and AFSA, as it became the Foreign Service Union later in 1970s, increased attention to retiree issues. DACOR, it ended its supplemental health insurance program in 1983. The Senior Living Foundation, launched by the American Foreign Service Protective Association in 1988, gradually supplanted DACOR's welfare role. The chair of the Memorial Committee was Lloyd Henderson, Ambassador Lloyd Henderson, who wanted to establish a memorial, a monument to the Foreign Service. And he managed to not only accomplish this, but also he acquired sections in the Rock Creek Cemetery, Washington's largest and oldest, for Foreign Service internment. In 1964, as a counterpart to Arlington Cemetery for uniformed military, DACOR began to offer plots in the DACOR Memorial area of Rock Creek Cemetery, a service that continues alongside the annual Memorial Day observances on May the 30th. By 1974, the DACOR Education and Welfare Fund had collected enough funds to offer its first academic fellowship. Fellowships grew with member contributions, bequests, and foundation trust grants, including the Tuck, $105,000 in 1975, plus continuing annual contributions, Green, $300,000 in 1984, and Hill, $948,000 in 1991, and more since. Grants over $5,000 are listed on a benefactor's plaque here. The foundation granted 6 graduate fellowships in 1980, 8 in 1985, and when the DACOR Bacon Foundation and the DACOR Education and Welfare Fund merged to form the DACOR Bacon House Foundation. There were 11 of them in 1990. By comparison, in 2019, the DACOR Bacon House Foundation provided 12 graduate fellowships and 22 undergraduate fellowships, including 12 grants administered by AFSA for children of Foreign Service members. DACOR Bacon House is itself a museum, which began offering public guided tours in 2009. Now, DACOR in the 1990s and its educational outreach efforts, it held its first annual seminar, which later became a conference in October of 1986. This was an off-site seminar at the Organization of American States. After holding sessions also at the World Bank and George Washington University, the conference is now held in DACOR Bacon House itself. The the department launched Foreign Service Day in 1965 with support from DACOR. Now, DACOR has traditionally held a reception the evening before and awarded the Foreign Service Cup on Foreign Service Day. DACOR also administers the annual Tragan Award for contributions to the Foreign Service community. DACOR in the 1970s continued support for education and international relations, created a tax-exempt DACOR Trust Fund in 1953 and in 1965, and then incorporated it as the DACOR Educational and Welfare Foundation, which allowed DACOR to engage in these scholarship programs that I have already mentioned, and the seminars, and production of monographs, and to maintain the library and the museum. But in 1965, its resources totaled only at about $4,328.60. In 1984, developers approached DACOR to buy the DACOR house, which was then located on 8th Street and surrounding properties from the commercial development. And at the same time, the DACOR Bacon, the Bacon House Foundation, which Virginia Murray established before she died in 1980, asked if DACOR would like to be a tenant in this house at 1801 F Street. But DACOR countered with a merger proposal, and that proposal was accepted. So DACOR sold its house on 8th Street and moved into the more spacious and historic DACOR Bacon House that has been described to you during my presentation here. Now, with the merger in 1985 of the DACOR Educational and Welfare Foundation and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation to form the DACOR Bacon House Foundation, again, had a new and more spacious, elegant home and new responsibilities for carrying out Virginia Bacon's goal of preserving her home as a center for frank and open discussion. Now, the distinction between DACOR and the DACOR House membership disappeared with reform of its dues structure in 2000. Other changes followed. Liquor lockers gave way to a liquor license, and restrictions on member-only use of DACOR facilities for private events and weddings were relaxed. In 2013, another bylaws revision expanded the criteria for associate members to include non-U.S. government foreign affairs professionals and others whose special circumstances warrant membership. DACOR more recently has initiated several member events, including an annual Robert Burns night dinner and cocktails on the patio, installation in 2018 of a ramp along F Street and of a new speaker system in the house gave members with disabilities better access to our activities. And more recently, the institution of weekly online speaker programs in response to COVID-19 has proven to be a boon for our expanded membership of the non-resident members. The approval in September of 2020 of the bylaw amendments on membership categories made all members equal as resident members, allowing all to vote and to stand for election as officers. So in the 90s, DACOR held its first annual seminar, as I have already mentioned. We will skip to its current activities. More recently, DACOR has entered into a mentorship agreement with a public HBCU, the University of the District of Columbia, which has developed a 15-hour undergraduate global studies curriculum. A DACOR member, the multi-state diplomat in residence, has partnered with the university and DACOR to provide in-house assistance with internships, in addition to DACOR's addition of a scholarship competition to graduating seniors. So what I've done is I've given you a thumbnail sketch of DACOR and the DACOR Bacon House Foundation. I've told you something of the rich history of the house, approaching its 2025 bicentennial and its first 100 years closely associated with the Supreme Court and the last 100 years of international understanding. I've talked about the history of DACOR. And finally, I've shared information about DACOR's programs and activities. Let me end about the benefits of DACOR membership, regardless of whether you live inside the resident membership circle of 50 miles from the DACOR Bacon House or a non-resident member outside of the 50-mile circle. As I said earlier, the COVID has taught us that you don't have to be a Washington metropolitan area member to take advantage of the several weekly programs, which are habitually now projected as hybrid programs, and they're all recorded for later use. I actually dream of the date before the end of my presidency that every closed office at every diplomatic mission will have a DACOR material shelf and access to our many digital programs. Membership does provide full access and use of the DACOR Bacon House to all members, resident or non-resident. This includes the use of the house for private events, private business purposes, including private dining rooms and the private settings or private areas and the larger dining areas. It's located near the White House, only 2 blocks, walking distance to the National Mall and its several museums and historical buildings. Better yet, members may use the 3 private historical period guest suites in the DACOR Bacon House. Membership gives access to no less than 26 reciprocal clubs nationally and internationally and building. And in fact, the chair of our reciprocal club committee, Leo Cicchini, who is a resident in Florida for 6 months and is a resident in Spain for the other 6 months, has done a fantastic job of establishing the reciprocal club privileges, and we continue to build as I speak. Actually, I received an email Monday evening from a DACOR member who had just returned from visiting London on a business trip. Let me just share with you just a little excerpt from that email. Jim, I just got back from a business trip in London, where I was able to use my DACOR reciprocity with the National Liberty Club, in which I hosted my London and Washington staff and a British member of Parliament for a lovely dinner. The reciprocity benefit is fabulous. With that, I rest my case. I'll be happy to address comments and answer any questions that you may have. And thank you for your attention.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Jim, for that presentation, very comprehensive from the historical standpoint and from the standpoint of those who are foreign service professionals. A debt of gratitude to the organization for the advocacy and for the steps it has taken on behalf of our service. So why don't I lead with the first question, and then please just as Rebecca was saying to everyone, please submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll pose them to Jim in the next few minutes. But I think you have indicated that in the past, the Corps was sort of on the leading edge of advocacy and support for the Foreign Service. Our service right now, arguably, you could say, is on life support. Is DACOR working with other organizations? I mean, AFSA would be one of them, and others, to try to strengthen advocacy for the foreign affairs profession and for the Foreign Service in particular?
Thank you for that very good question. The answer is yes, yes, and yes. We work very closely with AFSA, both in advocacy as well as in support for services to the DACOR community writ large. We provide scholarship assistance to several of the scholarship programs that are administered by AFSA. We also have created a committee, a public outreach committee. That committee works very closely with the Foreign Service, Foreign Affairs community writ large in providing information and materials to media, both social media and to the standard media. We have centered our activities in community-wide support in both advocacy as well as support through our public outreach committee.
Well, that's really interesting because, as they say, in unity there's strength, and it sounds like when enough people get together and echo the same concerns and thoughts, there'll be some better action and initiative. The idea of mentoring is one that students particularly is one that seems to have significant traction. The Naples Council on World Affairs, which I serve on here in Naples, Florida, is just embarking on a whole new outreach with local high schools and local colleges to try to strengthen mentoring programs for students who think they may be interested in international affairs. Is this sort of something that, with the resources you have behind you, you're now sort of embarking on in a new way? Is this sort of a new direction for the organization?
It's not a new direction, it's an expansion of a series of programs that we have been involved in mentoring over the years. We have an extensive mentoring program with George Washington University in postgraduate mentoring at the Elliott School of International Studies. That program has been underway now for several years. We have expanded it to special mentoring programs with other universities in the area. We have had targeted mentoring programs with the American University. And as I mentioned during the presentation, we are now expanding those mentorship programs into the HBCU, the Historical Black Colleges and Universities. It's not a new phase. We have been working with the HBCUs through the special acquisition programs, the Wrangle program, the Pickering program and the PAIN program, that is a program used in USAID. That we have decided now to expand it to the undergraduate programs at the University of the District of Columbia, where the university on its own developed a 15-hour global studies curriculum. And we have assigned mentors to the students that are participating in this curriculum. And the diplomat in residence is partnering with us to expand from our mentorship into internships and into the various scholarship programs that are available through the other programs that I have just mentioned. So what we are doing is we are expanding our participation in programs of working with potential foreign service officers through educational programs located at not just the local universities. I might add that we are working in conjunction with the National Museum of American Diplomacy, which is not yet open, but nevertheless, its educational outreach programs have been open for 2 years digitally across the country. Over 50,000 students have gone through the program, and DACOR has participated alongside the education section of the museum in working with both students as well as with teachers on the basics of curriculum preparation for international studies.
One of the things that seems to, from my standpoint, to be an innovation, and one of the questions asked is the fact that the Corps has widened the aperture for membership now to those who are involved in foreign affairs in different categories. Is that correct? It's no longer directed exclusively for former foreign service officers and that sort of thing? And if so, why did you decide to embark on that direction?
That is correct. And we made the decision to embark in that direction because we have found, first of all, as you know, the Foreign Service is one of the smallest government agencies, Department of State, with probably one of the most important roles and missions. And in order to have complete community and constituents support, we found that it was necessary to include all of the international affairs professions, whether they be in or out of government, looking at the roles, for instance, that the non-government organizations are playing in the execution of many of the Foreign Service activities abroad as a part of the a part of our execution of foreign policy. It was just a natural that we should then include those professions in international affairs into the ranks of our activities here in the DACOR Bacon House with programs such as the several salons that focus on topics that generally are oriented in those directions in the execution of foreign policy. In our normal noonday programs, we find that the input into those programs is as valuable from the non-government sources as from our government sources. So it was just a natural for DACOR to become more inclusive with the foreign affairs community. And by doing that, we are providing an additional support service to the Foreign Service writ large.
Well, Very, very helpful explanation. Thank you for that. So overall, I assume that for our membership, even though many of us are not resident in Washington, D.C., you still feel it's, aside from supporting a really worthy cause here, beneficial, and there's a number of areas where it really makes sense for us from the Florida perspective to join DACOR. Can you be a little bit more specific, your webinars perhaps, or what, if you're in Washington, staying in the House, which is just down from the State Department as well as near the White House on F Street. But are those capturing some of the specific reasons why it makes sense for us to join?
It makes sense for you to join because you are out there where we need to be. We don't need to convince the believers in Washington. We need to be out there where we get the support for the execution of foreign policy writ large. And as you know, and as we all can appreciate, our relevancy on Capitol Hill or wherever we are involved in supporting the execution of foreign policy, particularly in the global environment in which we are all, I won't say just living, but surviving, we need to be relevant outside of Washington. And that's where our non-resident membership comes into play. I would like to think that by just having a base, a platform, and with the many foreign service retiree associations provide a major support service to the execution of foreign policy. The average person, as you know, knows very little about what is it that we do in our embassies. What is it that we do in our diplomatic missions? What is it that we do in the many activities that support the execution of foreign policy abroad? How many know how much goes into providing the base for our being effective? How many know that less than 1% of our total budget goes in to providing platforms for our presence and our being able to, with some level of excellence, to do what we do? That's where we need to be relevant, not just DACOR, but the foreign affairs community writ large. We need to be outside of that 50-mile circle. And that's where organizations such as the Foreign Service, in particular, I would say, Foreign Service Retiree Association and associations come in. And I might say that Lynn Platt was visiting with us yesterday. She is a member of the board. And while we were talking about the program today, one of the members of the board leaned over and said to me, I'm a member of the Foreign Service Retiree Association in a certain state. And I would like to pass your contact information on to them. So thank you for getting that flame lit for us. And hopefully we'll be able to replicate this service throughout.
Absolutely. And for full disclosure, I'm also a member of DACOR, and hope some other members of FSRA will consider joining as well. I think as COVID conditions ease up and we'll have more opportunities for travel and in-person meetings, there's a lot that we need to be doing together on behalf of our common cause here. And we should really seriously consider different avenues for collaboration and for building on each other's strengths. We have time for one more question. I'll check and see if anybody has submitted one, or we'll then ask a final question of you, Jim. If you look at the future, do you have any sense of how our organizations are going to have to transform? Is it to be less insular, perhaps more open, less? You talk about how small we are as a service. Is that a real weakness increasingly, or will technology and new ways of communicating help us be better advocates for our service? I mean, how do you see the future in terms of our profession? That will be the last question, I promise.
And I like your answer. The answer is we have to be less insular. And that goes right back to the mother lode. That starts within the Foreign Service. There was a time before the communication technology explosion where you could conduct diplomacy behind closed doors. It doesn't happen that way anymore, as we all know. And one of the things that we are doing here in the foreign affairs community here in Washington, we're becoming less insular individually. ADST, the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, is working with DACOR, and DACOR is working with ADST in its historical base, where once upon a time we were thinking about doing publications here in DACOR of individual memoirs. But with the advent of the success of the largest collection of oral histories of international affairs in the world, housed at ADST, we have partnered with ADST, and we provide support to ADST in the expansion of their programs and their publication programs. We do their book launch programs here at DACOR. As I've already mentioned, with AFSA, we provide funds for a scholarship support that AFSA administers. We provide funding support to the American Protective Services for foreign service retirees who are in need of assistance. We provide funds in addition to other funding sources to the association. And in those strengths, in those numbers, there is the strength of our combined support to the foreign service and the execution of foreign policy. And thank you again for the opportunity to have participated and to have responded to even the last question.
So I think that this has been a very illuminating presentation and inspiring. I think we have a couple of questions about reciprocal clubs, which we can address. But I think some of our members are members of clubs that perhaps could reach out and develop cooperative relationships with DACOR. So that was something we could work on as well. But you demonstrate, I think, in a number of ways that our profession and diplomacy generally will continue to be a vital feature of our national security and our well-being. Diplomacy must and will continue to be extremely important in our national well-being. I hope that our members will seriously consider joining DACOR. I think there's been a number of programs and scholarship opportunities and reciprocal clubs and things like that will allow us to take full advantage of the DACOR Bacon House when traveling to Washington, D.C., and some of the webinars and things that we can pull down on online. But likewise, if you should decide to escape the winter weather, Jim, at some point, even for a few days, we'd be pleased to warmly welcome you here in Florida. Although we do have our cool days, but generally speaking, we're in the warm weather zone. I'd like to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available on the FSRA website within the next 48 hours. And then once again, Jim, our sincere thanks to you and your team, and we wish you every success.
Thank you very much.